You ever notice how the quiet ones never explain themselves? The voice came low and amused, cutting through the stale air of the briefing room like a blade wrapped in velvet, and a few of the younger operators smirked as they leaned back in their chairs, boots stretched out, arms crossed over chests built on confidence and recent victories, their attention fixed on the man who didn't belong, the man who sat near the far wall in a standard-issue wheelchair that looked too small for the weight of his presence, his hands resting loosely on the worn fabric of his jeans, his posture relaxed but not weak, his eyes steady but not searching, as if he had already seen everything this room could offer and found it lacking, and that was what bothered them most, not his age, not the faint scar tracing along his jaw, not even the fact that no one had introduced him, but the stillness, the kind that didn't ask for permission and didn't react to pressure, the kind that made noise feel unnecessary, and in a room full of Delta Force operators trained to dominate every space they entered, that silence felt like a challenge no one had issued out loud. Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole shifted first, rolling his shoulders as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth as he glanced at the others for silent approval, finding it instantly in the flicker of amused eyes and subtle nods. Then turning his attention back to the old man like a spotlight snapping into place. "So what's the deal here?" he said, casual, almost friendly, but edged with something sharper underneath. "We running a history lesson today, or did someone lose their way from the visitor center?" A few quiet chuckles followed, soft but deliberate, designed to land, designed to test, but the man didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink in response, his gaze drifting briefly toward the far window where the late afternoon light stretched long across the polished floor, catching dust in the air like suspended time, and that lack of reaction only fed the tension, made it coil tighter beneath the surface, because disrespect needed friction to feel complete, and here it found none. Cole exhaled through his nose, a hint of irritation breaking through the amusement as he tapped his fingers once against his knee, then tried again, this time more direct, more pointed. "Let's keep it simple," he said, voice firm now, carrying across the room without effort. "What was your call sign?" The question hung there, clean and sharp, cutting through the low hum of air conditioning and distant rotor noise outside, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the entire room leaned in without realizing it, waiting for something, anything, a reaction, a correction, a story, but the man remained exactly as he was, still, grounded, untouched by the weight of the question, his hands unmoving, his breathing slow and even, as if time worked differently for him, as if seconds didn't rush past but settled, layered, measured, and somewhere near the back of the room, Master Sergeant Daniel Reyes felt something shift, not in the air, not in the posture of the operators, but in the quiet itself. The kind of quiet he had only ever felt once before, far from any base, far from any briefing room. The kind that meant something had already happened long before anyone else realized it, and he straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to study the old man more closely, while up front Cole let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh, shaking his head as he leaned back again. "Yeah," he added, voice lighter but with a harder edge now, "that's what I thought," and a few of the others smirked again, the room settling into that comfortable rhythm of assumption, of easy conclusions, of knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't, but the man by the wall didn't accept any of it, didn't confirm it, didn't reject it, he simply sat there, unmoved, as if the question hadn't missed its mark, but hadn't reached it yet either. The laughter did not last long, not because anyone told it to stop, but because it began to sound hollow even to the men who made it, like something rehearsed instead of earned, and that was enough to unsettle the edges of the room in a way none of them could quite explain. Cole leaned back further in his chair, one boot hooked over the opposite knee, arms folding across his chest as if sealing his judgment in place. But his eyes did not leave the man by the wall. There was something in that stillness that did not match the outcome he expected, something that refused to react in the way people usually did when they were out of place, and it created a quiet friction beneath his confidence, a subtle irritation that made him speak again just to fill the space. "You do not remember, or you never had one," he said, slower now, each word measured, as if clarity would force a response, but again there was nothing. No correction, no defense, not even a glance in his direction. The man's gaze remained steady, angled slightly toward the window, following something invisible beyond the glass, and for a brief moment it felt less like he was ignoring them and more like he was somewhere else entirely, not physically, but mentally, as if the room around him was only a temporary stop along a much longer path, one that none of them could see. Near the back, Reyes shifted his weight, arms uncrossing as his attention sharpened. His instincts, trained over years of reading people in environments where details mattered more than words, were quietly insisting that something did not align. It was not the clothes, not the chair, not even the age, it was the absence of reaction under pressure, the kind of composure that did not come from discipline alone but from experience layered so deep it no longer needed to prove itself, and that realization sat heavy in his chest, unspoken but growing. One of the younger operators, trying to reclaim the mood, leaned forward with a smirk and reached toward the man's chest, fingers brushing against a small, worn piece of metal clipped near the seam of his jacket. It was nothing impressive at first glance, dull, slightly bent, the kind of thing most people would overlook without a second thought. "What is this supposed to be?" he said, voice light, almost playful, but carrying that same undercurrent of dismissal, and when his fingers tapped it, just once, the sound was faint, barely audible, but the effect was immediate in a way no one else could see, because the man's hand moved, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a precision that suggested control rather than reaction, his fingers closing gently over the object, covering it, shielding it without force, and for the first time, his eyes shifted, not wide, not sharp, but focused, landing on the operator's hand with a weight that made the younger man pause without understanding why. The room did not notice the shift right away, the air still filled with that lingering expectation of humor, but Reyes felt it instantly, like a pressure change before a storm, subtle but undeniable, and he straightened fully now, his gaze locked on the man's face, searching, connecting fragments that had not yet formed a complete picture. While Cole's expression tightened just slightly, the grin fading at the edges as something unspoken began to replace it, not respect, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes just before certainty breaks apart. And still, the man said nothing, not a single word, his hand resting over that small piece of metal, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the question had not been answered because it had not yet reached the point where an answer was necessary. And in that growing quiet, the room began, slowly, almost reluctantly, to lose control of the narrative it thought it understood. The room did not shift all at once, it never does. It moved in fragments, in small, almost invisible adjustments that only someone paying close attention could feel, the kind of change that started in the eyes before it reached the posture. Reyes saw it first in the way the younger operator slowly pulled his hand back without making a joke about it, without finishing the sentence he had started, as if something in that brief contact had quietly removed the need to perform, and that alone was enough to confirm what had been building in the back of his mind. This was not a misunderstanding, this was something else entirely. Cole noticed it too, not as clearly, not as deeply, but enough to feel the control slipping from his side of the room, and that irritated him more than anything else, because control was supposed to be automatic here, it was supposed to be theirs, earned through training, reinforced through repetition, and yet somehow it was being challenged by a man who had not raised his voice, had not stood up, had not even acknowledged the authority that surrounded him. Cole leaned forward again, slower this time, more deliberate, his tone losing some of its earlier ease as he spoke. "You know, it is not complicated," he said, each word landing with a little more weight than before. "Everyone in this room has one, it is not a trick question," and still nothing came back, not even a glance. The man's hand remained resting over that small piece of metal, his thumb tracing its edge once, almost absent-mindedly, like someone confirming that something real was still there, something that did not need to be explained to anyone else. The silence stretched, but this time it was not empty, it carried something heavier, something that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls had moved in just enough to remind everyone that space was not guaranteed. Reyes took a step forward now, subtle but intentional, his boots making a soft sound against the polished floor, and that sound seemed louder than it should have been, because there was nothing left to compete with it, no laughter, no side comments, just the quiet weight of a moment that had not yet revealed its meaning. He stopped a few feet closer, his eyes fixed on the man's face, studying the lines, the stillness, the way his breathing never changed, and then his gaze dropped, just slightly, to the small piece of metal partially hidden beneath the man's hand. Something about it tugged at a memory he could not fully place, not a clear image, not a name, but a feeling, the kind that came from stories told in lower voices, from briefings that ended with less explanation than they started with, and his chest tightened just enough to make him aware of it. Cole exhaled sharply through his nose, frustration edging into his expression now, because the lack of response had turned into something worse than defiance. It had become indifference, and indifference was harder to push against, harder to break. "Look," he said, voice firmer now, almost flat, "either you had won or you did not," and for a second, it seemed like the words might finally land, like they might reach whatever line had not yet been crossed, because the man's head tilted just slightly, not much, just enough to acknowledge that something had been said, and then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze shifted away from the window and settled forward, not on Cole, not on any one person, but into the space itself, as if he were addressing something larger than the room, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying no strain, no hesitation, just a simple clarity that did not ask for attention but took it anyway. "You are asking the wrong way," he said, and the words did not sound like a correction, they sounded like a fact, something already decided long before this moment, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because the room did not react with laughter this time, it did not fill the space with noise to regain balance, it held still, every man in it feeling, whether they understood it or not, that the moment they had been pushing toward had just shifted direction, and they were no longer the ones leading it. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise, like something placed rather than thrown, and for a moment no one moved, not because they were ordered to, but because the room had lost its rhythm, the easy cadence of control that had been there only seconds ago. Cole felt it first as a break in expectation, the kind that made his next response hesitate just long enough to be noticed. His jaw tightened slightly as he shifted in his seat, leaning forward again, but this time without the relaxed confidence he had carried before. "Then explain it," he said, the edge in his voice sharper now, less amused, more demanding, as if clarity could restore the balance that had slipped, but the man did not answer immediately, he did not rush to fill the space, instead his hand moved, slow and deliberate, uncovering the small piece of metal just enough for it to catch the light, and for a brief second it reflected something faint across the polished table, not bright, not polished, but worn in a way that suggested time rather than neglect. His fingers rested beside it now, no longer shielding, simply acknowledging its presence, and Reyes felt that same quiet pressure tighten again in his chest, stronger this time, because recognition was no longer just a feeling, it was forming into something closer to certainty. He took another step forward, closer than before, his voice lower when he spoke, not to challenge, but to confirm. "Sir," he said carefully, the word chosen with intention, with respect that had not yet been explained to anyone else in the room, and that single shift did more than any argument could have, it cracked the surface of assumption that had been holding everything together. A few of the operators glanced toward him, confusion flickering across their faces, because respect in this room was not given lightly, and never without reason. Cole noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked from Reyes back to the man in the chair, recalculating, adjusting, but still resisting the conclusion that was beginning to form. The man finally spoke again, his voice the same as before, steady, grounded, unaffected by the tension that now filled the space. "You do not ask for a call sign," he said, each word measured, not as a correction, but as something fundamental. "You recognize it," and the sentence landed differently than anything before it, not as a statement to be debated, but as a boundary, something that separated those who understood from those who did not. The room held that line in silence, no one laughing now, no one interrupting. Even the air seemed to settle, the low hum of the building pressing in around them. Reyes exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the piece of metal, then lifting back to the man's face, connecting something he had heard years ago in a place far removed from this one, something about names that were not spoken often, about identifiers that did not belong in reports or databases, and his voice came quieter this time, almost to himself. "That is not possible," but it was not disbelief. It was realization catching up to truth. Cole shifted again, this time rising slightly from his chair, not fully standing, but no longer relaxed, the need to regain control pushing him forward. "Then say it," he pressed, more forceful now, "if it matters that much, just say it." And for the first time since he had entered the room, the man's gaze settled directly, not on Cole, not on Reyes, but through them, as if measuring something beyond their presence, and then, without raising his voice. Without changing his posture, he spoke, slow, clear, and final, Titan. He paused, not for effect, but because the word carried its own weight, 3, and the moment the second word left his mouth, the room did not react, it did not move, it did not breathe the same way it had before, because something had shifted beyond correction, beyond argument, into recognition, and in that silence, deeper than anything that had come before it, every man in that room understood, whether they wanted to or not, that they had just crossed into a space where they were no longer the highest authority. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the kind of stillness that carried weight instead of emptiness, and for the first time since the exchange began, no one in the room tried to fill it, because there was nothing left to add that would not feel misplaced. Cole remained half standing, caught between motion and hesitation, his expression no longer confident, no longer amused, but searching, recalculating, as if trying to find a version of events where what he had just heard did not carry the meaning it clearly did, but there was none, because the name had landed exactly where it was meant to, and it had not been offered, it had been revealed. Reyes felt it fully now, the recognition no longer partial, no longer uncertain, it was complete, and with it came a quiet shift in posture, subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders squared, his stance grounded, not out of tension, but out of respect that no longer needed confirmation. His voice did not rise when he spoke again, but it carried a different tone now, one that no longer questioned. Sir, he said, and this time the word did not sound like a possibility, it sounded like acknowledgement, and that single word echoed differently in the room than any of the earlier voices had, because it was not challenging anything, it was aligning with something already true. A few of the operators exchanged quick glances, confusion giving way to awareness, because Reyes was not a man who shifted lightly, not without reason. And that alone began to change the atmosphere. Piece by piece, Cole straightened slowly, fully standing now, but without the earlier dominance, his arms lowering to his sides, his stance adjusting unconsciously as if responding to a signal he had not consciously received, his eyes locked on the man in the chair, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that might reduce the weight of what had just been said. But the man offered none of it. He did not reinforce the statement, did not elaborate, did not even look directly at Cole, his gaze resting forward again, calm, steady, as if the moment had already passed for him, as if the name he had spoken did not require reaction because it had never been meant for display. Reyes took one more step closer, stopping just within a respectful distance, his eyes dropping briefly to the small piece of metal, then lifting again, and in that moment the last piece connected, not from sight, not from memory alone, but from understanding, the kind that comes from hearing certain names spoken only in specific contexts. Names that never appeared on lists, never showed up in records, but were carried quietly between those who needed to know, and his breath slowed as the realization settled completely. I heard about you, he said, not loudly, not for the room, but it carried anyway, because there was no noise left to compete with it, and that statement did more than explain anything, it confirmed everything. Cole's posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to show the internal change. His shoulders no longer squared in challenge, but held in a more neutral line, his weight balanced, his presence no longer pushing forward but holding position. The others followed in smaller ways, boots adjusting, arms uncrossing, the subtle movements of men who were used to adapting quickly when new information demanded it, and through all of it, the man remained exactly the same, unchanged by the shift around him, his hand resting lightly beside the worn metal, his breathing even, his expression neutral, not detached, not distant, simply present in a way that did not need validation, and that was what settled it completely, because in a room built on hierarchy, on rank, on visible proof of authority, the strongest presence was now the one that had none of those things on display, and no one questioned it anymore. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it had crossed the line from uncertainty into quiet alignment, not commanded, not instructed, but understood in a way that required no words, and that was what made it unmistakable. The operators who had once leaned back now sat upright without realizing they had moved, their attention no longer scattered, no longer casual, but focused, anchored, as if something invisible had drawn a boundary through the space and they had instinctively stepped to the correct side of it. Cole felt it most sharply, not because he resisted it anymore, but because he recognized it too late, the realization settling in with a Weight that was difficult to ignore, his earlier tone, his posture, the way he had framed the question, all of it replayed silently in the back of his mind, not as regret, but as recalibration, the kind that happens when a situation reveals itself to be something entirely different than it first appeared. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising just enough to steady himself, then spoke again, but the edge was gone now, replaced by something more controlled, more deliberate. "Why are you here?" he asked, and this time it was not a challenge, it was a question meant to understand, meant to bridge the gap that had opened, and for the first time since the exchange began, the man answered without delay, his voice unchanged, still calm, still grounded, but now carrying a direction that had not been there before. "I was told to observe," he said, simple, direct, without explanation, and that answer did not reduce the tension. It clarified it, because observation implied purpose, and purpose implied authority that did not need to be announced. Reyes absorbed the words immediately, his mind moving ahead of the moment, connecting implications faster than they could be spoken. If someone had sent him, then someone higher already knew, and if someone higher knew, then this was not an accident, not a coincidence, it was intentional, and that realization settled deeper than anything else so far, because it meant the room had been under evaluation from the moment the man had entered, not the other way around. Cole felt it as well, the shift in perspective landing with quiet force, his role no longer dominant, no longer central, but part of something being measured, and that awareness changed the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders, no longer projecting outward, but contained, precise. The others followed in smaller adjustments, a glance here, a straightened posture there. The subtle synchronization of men who understood hierarchy even when it was not visible. The man in the chair remained still, his hand resting beside the worn metal, his gaze steady, not scanning, not judging, simply present, and that presence carried more weight than any rank insignia could have, because it did not need to prove itself, it existed independently of acknowledgement. Reyes lowered his voice slightly, stepping just a fraction closer. "Careful, respectful, who sent you?" he asked, and the question was not asked lightly, it carried the weight of everything that had been understood so far. The man did not look at him immediately, his eyes remaining forward for a moment longer, as if considering whether the answer was necessary, and then he spoke, just as calmly as before. "You will know soon enough," and that was all, no name, no explanation, just a statement that closed the gap without filling it. And somehow that made the room even quieter, because now the uncertainty was no longer about who he was, that had been resolved, now it was about what came next, and for the first time since the beginning, no one in the room tried to control that outcome, they simply waited. Time stretched in a way no clock could measure, the kind of slow, deliberate passing that made every small sound feel amplified, the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant echo of boots somewhere down the hallway, even the subtle shift of fabric as someone adjusted their stance, all of it settling into the same heavy quiet that now defined the room, and no one spoke, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because anything said too soon would feel misplaced, premature, as if interrupting something that had not yet fully arrived. Reyes held his position, his posture steady, his attention fixed, but his mind had already moved ahead, mapping possibilities, narrowing them down, because there were only a handful of people who could send someone like this without explanation, and none of them operated without purpose. Cole remained still as well, his earlier need to control the situation replaced by a measured awareness, his breathing slower now, more controlled, his eyes no longer searching for weakness, but watching for confirmation. And then it came, not with force, not with urgency, but with a simple, unmistakable sound, the soft click of the door handle turning, subtle, almost quiet, but in the silence it cut through everything. Every head in the room turned at once, not sharply, not abruptly, but in a unified motion that spoke of instinct rather than command. The door opened just enough to reveal a figure in the hallway beyond, the light from outside casting a long, clean line across the floor, and for a fraction of a second, no one moved, because recognition did not happen instantly, it arrived in layers, first the outline, then the posture, then the presence, and when it settled fully, the effect was immediate. Chairs shifted softly, boots aligned, spine straightened, not exaggerated, not dramatic, but precise, controlled, the kind of movement that came from years of training responding to something that did not need to announce itself. General Marcus Hale stepped into the room without hesitation, his uniform crisp, His pace measured, his expression neutral but focused, and yet the weight he carried was unmistakable, not because of rank alone, but because of the way the room adjusted around him without being told to. His eyes did not scan the room the way a newcomer's might, they moved with purpose, passing over each operator without pause, without lingering, until they reached the man in the chair, and then they stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a finality that made everything else in the room fall away. For a brief moment, nothing else existed, no tension, no uncertainty, no lingering questions, just that single point of focus, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his pace, the general took 2 steps forward, closing the distance, and spoke. "Sir." The word was simple, quiet, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said in the room so far, because it did not question, it did not confirm, it recognized, completely and without hesitation. And in that instant, whatever doubt remained dissolved entirely. The room did not react with surprise, it did not need to, the reaction had already happened internally, silently, each man adjusting to the reality in front of them. Cole felt it settle fully now, the final piece locking into place, his posture straightened instinctively, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of understanding. Reyes lowered his gaze just slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. And through all of it, the man in the chair remained unchanged, his hands resting calmly, his breathing steady, his presence exactly as it had been from the beginning, as if the arrival of authority did not elevate him, but simply confirmed what had already been true all along. No one moved after that single word, not because they were ordered to remain still, but because motion itself felt unnecessary in the presence of something already resolved. General Hale did not repeat himself, did not expand on the greeting, he simply held the moment as it was, his posture firm but not rigid, his eyes steady on the man in the chair, and in that stillness there was no confusion, no ambiguity, only recognition that required no explanation. The operators in the room remained aligned, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet discipline that no longer needed to prove itself. Cole stood fully upright now, his stance precise, shoulders squared, not in defiance but in correction, the shift complete, his earlier tone gone without trace, replaced by a silence that carried its own form of acknowledgement. Reyes remained slightly forward, his head inclined just enough to signal understanding, his expression composed, but behind it the realization continued to settle deeper, because this was no longer about a name or a story, it was about presence, about a kind of authority that did not need structure to exist. General Hale took one final step closer, stopping just within conversational distance, and for a brief moment the room seemed to narrow around that space, as if everything outside of it had faded. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, controlled, carrying the weight of command without force. "We have been expecting you," he said, and the words did not sound like a formality, they sounded like confirmation of a plan already in motion. The man in the chair did not react with surprise, did not nod, did not acknowledge the statement in any visible way. His gaze remained steady, his breathing unchanged, as if expectation had never been part of his consideration, as if arrival and presence were simply 2 points along the same line. General Hale gave a slight nod, not exaggerated, not ceremonial, but precise, and that small motion carried more meaning than any extended explanation could have. It signaled completion, alignment, and acceptance all at once. He then turned slightly, just enough to address the room without fully breaking his orientation, his voice still calm, still measured. "You will continue as briefed," he said, and though the instruction was simple, it landed differently now, because the room understood that whatever had been planned before had already been observed, evaluated, and measured without their awareness, and that realization settled into their posture, into their silence, into the way they held themselves. Cole gave a single, controlled nod, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. Reyes stepped back half a pace, returning to position with a precision that reflected both discipline and respect. The others followed in similar fashion, small, synchronized adjustments that restored order without disrupting the stillness that remained, and through all of it, the man in the chair remained unchanged, not elevated, not acknowledged beyond what had already been given, simply present, as if the entire sequence had not altered his position in any way, as if it had only revealed it to those who had not seen it before. And that was what lingered longest after the moment passed, not the words, not the movement, but the understanding that some authority does not arrive, it is simply recognized when the time comes. The room did not return to what it had been before, it could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not in rank, not in command structure, but in understanding, the kind that stays long after words are gone. General Hale stepped back just enough to re-establish the space, his presence still anchoring the room, but no longer the sole center of gravity, because that had already been revealed. The operators moved with renewed precision, their motions quieter, sharper, as if every action now carried an awareness that had not been there earlier. Cole remained standing for a moment longer before easing back into position, not fully relaxed, not rigid, but balanced, his gaze drifting once more toward the man in the chair, and this time there was no trace of challenge in it, only a measured respect that did not need to be spoken. Reyes exhaled slowly, the tension that had built earlier now settling into clarity, his posture aligned, his attention forward, but part of his focus remained anchored on the presence behind him, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that something rare had just unfolded in a way that could not be repeated. The man in the chair adjusted slightly, a small shift of weight, the faint creak of the wheelchair barely audible against the low hum of the room. His hand moved once more to the worn piece of metal, not gripping it, not hiding it, simply resting there, as if confirming that nothing had changed, and in a way, nothing had, because everything that had been revealed was already there from the beginning, unnoticed, unacknowledged, but constant. General Hale gave a final glance across the room, not inspecting, not questioning, but ensuring alignment, and then his attention returned briefly to the man, a subtle nod exchanged, not formal, not ceremonial, but understood, and with that, he turned, moving toward the door with the same measured pace he had entered with, the light from the hallway catching his uniform as he stepped through, the door closing behind him with a soft, definitive sound that marked the end of something without announcing it. And still, the room remained quiet for a moment longer. Not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the space that had just been occupied. Cole finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, directed not at anyone in particular, but into the air itself. Understood, and the word carried weight now, not as acknowledgement of an order, but as acceptance of something larger. Reyes gave a slight nod, mirroring the sentiment without adding to it. The others followed, each man settling into position, into role, into clarity, and through it all, the man in the chair remained exactly as he had been, unchanged, unaffected by the shift around him, as if the moment had not elevated him, but simply revealed him to those who had been ready to see. And after a few seconds, he spoke one final time, his voice quiet, steady, carrying no need for emphasis. Continue, and that was all, no explanation, no instruction beyond a single word. Yet it carried through the room with a clarity that required no repetition. The operators moved, not hurried, not uncertain, but precise, focused, aligned, and as the briefing resumed, as voices returned in controlled, professional tones, something remained beneath it all, a quiet understanding that would not fade with time, that respect is not assigned, it is recognized, and some names are never meant to be announced, only remembered.